March 1945. The world was on the edge of something unthinkable. In the heart of northwestern Germany, the Nazi regime was collapsing, and the air itself seemed thick with the scent of defeat. For 12 years, the German people had been told exactly who their enemies were, taught to fear, to hate, to expect the worst from the Allied soldiers now marching across their shattered homeland. But what happened when those enemies finally arrived? What if everything you'd been told about them, every warning, every nightmare, every whispered rumor, turned out to be a lie? This is the story of a moment when worlds collided. When German women, raised on a steady diet of Nazi propaganda, came face to face with Allied soldiers for the very first time. And not just any soldiers, these were Canadians, part of the massive Allied force that had stormed through the Rhineland and was now pushing deeper into the heart of Hitler's crumbling empire. For the women who met them, the shock wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't terror at the hands of brutal conquerors. It was the realization that the men standing before them were nothing like the monsters they'd been taught to fear. Imagine living your entire life inside a carefully constructed reality, only to have it shattered in a single day. That's what happened in those final weeks of World War II. The stories these women had believed, the stories that had shaped their choices, their loyalties, even their sense of self, were suddenly exposed as fiction. And in that moment, as the truth broke through, some of them would never see the world the same way again. But why did this moment matter? Why should anyone in America today care about what happened in a ruined farmhouse or a makeshift prison camp on the other side of the Atlantic, more than 70 years ago? Because this isn't just a story about the past. It's a story about the power of propaganda, the danger of believing what you're told without question, and the incredible, unpredictable ways that ordinary people can change when confronted with the truth. It's about how fear is built, how it's used, and how it can be dismantled, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. So what did these German women actually see when they met their so-called enemies? What did they feel, and how did it change them? And what can we, living in a world still shaped by the echoes of that war, learn from their experience? The answers aren't simple, but they're worth searching for, because sometimes the most shocking revelations come not from violence or hatred, but from the quiet, undeniable humanity of the people we're told to fear. And as the Allied armies closed in and the old world crumbled, the stage was set for a confrontation that would upend everything. The truth was about to break through, and nothing would ever be the same. To understand the shock that would hit these German women, you have to step inside the world they were living in, a world built on fear, suspicion, and relentless propaganda. By March 1945, Germany was a nation on the brink of collapse. The Allied armies, American, British, Canadian, were pouring in from the west, while the Soviets closed in from the east. Cities that had stood for centuries were now piles of rubble. The roads were cratered, the skies filled with the constant drone of bombers, and the future was nothing but a question mark. For millions of ordinary Germans, especially women, every day was a battle for survival. But the physical destruction was only part of the story. For over a decade, the Nazi regime had waged a different kind of war, a war for the minds of its people. From the moment Hitler took power, the German public was bombarded with a single, unrelenting message: the Allies were monsters. American soldiers in particular were painted as ruthless invaders, driven by hatred and a desire for revenge. The propaganda was everywhere, on the radio, in newspapers, in classrooms, even in church sermons. It was designed to make surrender unthinkable and to make fear a permanent part of daily life. Women were targeted with special intensity. They were told that if the Allies broke through, they would face horrors beyond imagination. The Nazi message was clear. American and Canadian troops were not just enemies, they were a threat to everything German women held dear. The propaganda machine played on every possible fear. It warned of racial diversity in the Allied ranks, describing American soldiers, black, white, Latino, Native American, as unpredictable and dangerous. It claimed that surrender would mean violence, humiliation, and the destruction of German families. Even kindness, they were told, was a trick, a way to corrupt German women with foreign ideas about freedom and democracy. This wasn't just background noise. It was a drumbeat that shaped every decision, every conversation, every sleepless night. Girls grew up hearing these warnings in school and youth groups. Mothers repeated them at the dinner table. Neighbors whispered them in bomb shelters. The fear was so deeply woven into daily life that it became almost invisible, a constant, low-level anxiety that colored every thought about the future. And as the Allied armies drew closer, that fear only grew. Rumors spread like wildfire. Stories of atrocities, some real, many invented, were passed from house to house, growing more terrifying with each retelling. The message was always the same: the enemy is coming, and when they arrive, nothing will ever be the same. For many German women, the idea of capture was worse than death. Some even believed that a bullet was preferable to falling into Allied hands. But here's the twist. While the Nazi regime was collapsing, its propaganda was still working. Even as the front lines crumbled and the old certainties vanished, the fear of the enemy remained. It was the last thing holding the shattered pieces of German society together. And it set the stage for one of the most unexpected confrontations of the entire war, a moment when ordinary women would come face to face with the truth and discover that the real world was nothing like the nightmare they'd been taught to expect. What happened next would not only change their lives but would also reveal just how powerful and how fragile the stories we tell ourselves can be. To truly grasp the impact of what was about to unfold, you need to meet the women at the heart of this story, three ordinary Germans whose lives had been shaped by war, loss, and the relentless drumbeat of Nazi propaganda. Their names were Margaret, Elsa, and Katha. Each came from a different world, but all were about to face a reality that would shake the very foundation of everything they believed. Margaret Hoffmann was 34, a senior nurse from Hanover. She had trained at one of Germany's most prestigious nursing schools, and her hands had saved lives on battlefields from Poland to France. Margaret wasn't a fanatic. She joined the Nazi Party because it was expected, because it made her career easier, not because she believed in every word. But she had seen the devastation of Allied bombing raids. Her own city of Hanover hit 88 times, more than 6,000 civilians killed. She prayed every night, but she also remembered what her neighbor had whispered: better a bullet than a Canadian. For Margaret, fear wasn't just propaganda, it was personal, rooted in the horrors she'd witnessed firsthand. Elsa Brenner was just 19, a signals operator and former youth leader in the BDM, the Nazi girls' organization. Elsa had never known a world without Hitler. She joined the movement at age 10, risen to lead a group of 32 younger girls, and believed every lesson she'd been taught. Her city, Cologne, was 61% destroyed by Allied bombs. Elsa's diary described her parents' street as looking like the surface of the moon. She still wore her BDM pin, though she wasn't sure why anymore. For Elsa, the war was all she'd ever known, and the fear of the enemy was as natural as breathing. Katha Schreiber was 52, a schoolteacher and Red Cross coordinator from the small town of Cleves. Her life had been marked by loss: one son killed in Italy, another missing on the Eastern Front. Her home was 90% destroyed in a single night of bombing. Katha carried a photograph of her lost son Hinz at age 4 laughing on a donkey at a village fair. She'd seen the world change before. She remembered British and Canadian soldiers from the First World War, ordinary men, not monsters. But 25 years of propaganda had buried those memories deep. Now, fear was the only thing left to hold onto. These three women were not villains. They were not heroes. They were survivors, each carrying their own scars, each shaped by a system that had taught them to fear the outside world. Their stories are not just about Germany, they're about what happens when ordinary people are swept up in the tides of history, when the lines between truth and fiction blur. And when the only thing left to trust is what you see with your own eyes. As the Allied armies closed in, Margaret, Elsa, and Katha found themselves on the front lines of a different kind of battle. A battle for their own beliefs, their own sense of reality. They didn't know it yet, but the next 48 hours would change them forever. The doors would open, the rifles would lower, and for the first time they would look into the faces of the men they'd been taught to fear. What they saw would be nothing like the stories they'd been told. And as their worlds collided with the truth, the real shock was only just beginning. The moment of capture was supposed to be the end. For Margaret, Elsa, and Katha, it was the moment every warning, every nightmare, every whispered rumor had pointed toward. The Allied armies, Americans, Canadians, British, were now a living, breathing presence in the heart of Germany. The fear was so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every breath. For years, these women had been told that when the enemy arrived, there would be no mercy. But when the doors finally opened, what happened next was nothing like the stories they'd been told. Margaret was working in a farmhouse, tending to wounded soldiers when the Canadians arrived. She heard boots on the floorboards, the sharp command of voices in a language she barely understood. Her heart pounded as a rifle appeared in the doorway, raised, then slowly lowered. She braced herself for violence, for chaos, for the brutality she'd been taught to expect. But instead there was a strange, almost bureaucratic calm. The soldiers moved with quiet efficiency, more interested in paperwork than punishment. Margaret waited for the worst, but nothing happened. Through the window, she watched Canadian troops moving around the yard, their movements organized, almost routine. It reminded her, against her will, of a well-run hospital. The shock wasn't violence, it was the absence of it. Elsa's capture came on a muddy road outside Cologne. She was marched west in a column of prisoners, Canadian soldiers walking beside them. She expected to be shoved, screamed at, maybe worse. But the march was strangely uneventful. When an older German soldier stumbled, a Canadian guard caught his arm, steadying him without a word. Elsa saw it and looked away, unable to process what she'd witnessed. Each step filled her mind with contradictions. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, but here was a moment of simple human kindness. The story she'd been told was already starting to unravel. Katha's experience was different, but just as jarring. She rode in the back of a Canadian military truck, sitting on a wooden bench with other German women. The landscape outside was a wasteland, broken buildings, cratered roads, a country in ruins. But the convoy itself moved with a confidence she hadn't seen in years. Allied vehicles streamed past in an endless line, a display of power and organization that was almost surreal. Katha counted trucks until she lost track. She realized with a sinking feeling that the world she'd known was gone, replaced by something she didn't understand. At every turn, the reality of capture was nothing like the nightmare they'd been promised. There were no beatings, no shouted threats, no acts of revenge. Instead, there was waiting. There were forms to fill out, names to record, belongings to be catalogued. The Canadian soldiers seemed almost bored, more focused on their routines than on the prisoners themselves. For women who had spent years living in terror, the sheer ordinariness of it all was its own kind of shock. But beneath the surface, something profound was happening. The first cracks were appearing in the wall of fear that had defined their lives. The enemy was no longer a faceless monster. He was a young man eating from a tin, a guard steadying a stumbling prisoner, a medic with a gentle touch. The world was shifting, and nothing would ever be the same. And as the hours passed, a new question began to form. If everything they'd been told about the enemy was wrong, what else might be a lie? For Margaret, Elsa, and Katha, the hours after capture unfolded in a blur of confusion and disbelief. The terror they'd braced for never arrived. Instead, they were swept into a process that felt more like a strange, foreign bureaucracy than the nightmare they'd been promised. The Canadian and Allied soldiers, so often painted as monsters in Nazi propaganda, seemed almost indifferent, focused on paperwork, order, and routine. For women who had spent years expecting brutality, the reality was both anticlimactic and deeply unsettling. Margaret was kept in the farmhouse for hours, waiting as Canadian soldiers secured the area. She sat in the same room where she'd been tending wounds, her mind racing with questions. Through the window she watched soldiers moving with calm precision, their uniforms clean, their faces untroubled. When she was finally escorted outside, she joined a group of other German prisoners at a crossroads. The guards stood at a distance, rifles slung casually, one of them eating from a tin and watching the road. Margaret tried to reconcile this scene with everything she'd been told. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, but here was a moment of almost mundane normalcy. Elsa's journey was equally surreal. She was marched for hours along a busy road, Allied vehicles streaming past in the opposite direction. The Canadian soldiers walked beside the prisoners, matching their pace, never raising their voices. When an older German soldier stumbled, a Canadian guard caught him, steadying him without a word. Elsa tucked the memory away, unable to make sense of it. Each step filled her with more questions. The enemy was supposed to be merciless, but here was a simple act of kindness. The propaganda she'd grown up with was already starting to crumble. Katha's experience was marked by a different kind of shock. She rode in the back of a Canadian military truck, the canvas flapping open to reveal a landscape of devastation. But the convoy itself was a marvel of organization, trucks, tanks, ambulances, all moving with a steady, unstoppable rhythm. Katha counted vehicles until she lost track, realizing that the Allies' power was not just in their weapons, but in their ability to keep moving, to keep functioning, even as Germany fell apart. It was a display of strength she hadn't seen in years, and it left her feeling both awed and defeated. Processing took place in a requisition factory, a place stripped of its former purpose and repurposed for the machinery of war. Each woman's name, rank, and hometown were recorded. Their belongings were searched, but not with cruelty, just methodical efficiency. Medical exams followed, conducted by Canadian doctors and nurses who treated the prisoners with brisk professionalism. Margaret, herself a nurse, was quietly stunned by the quality of care. The supplies were better than anything she'd seen in months. For Elsa, the process was almost clinical. Her BDM pin was taken, catalogued, and placed in an envelope. She waited for punishment, but none came. Small acts of humanity stood out in sharp relief. Katha was handed a cup of real tea, something she hadn't tasted in years. She wrapped her hands around the metal cup, breathing in the steam, and thought of her late husband who had loved tea above all else. The gesture was simple, but it cut through years of fear and suspicion. The journey continued, by train through the Netherlands, then by ship across the North Sea. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Outside the windows, Dutch towns stood intact, their lights glowing in the night, their roads unbroken. The Allied world was functioning, orderly, alive. For the German women, it was like stepping into another reality. Below deck, seasickness and anxiety mingled in the cramped quarters. Margaret, immune to the motion, moved quietly among the women, offering water, comfort, and a steady hand. At one point, a Canadian nurse joined her, and for hours the two worked side by side, two professionals, two former enemies, united by the simple act of caring for the sick. In that moment, language barriers and national loyalties faded away, replaced by something universal. As the ship docked in England, the women stepped onto British soil for the first time. The port was intact, the people ordinary, the world moving on. For Elsa, the feeling was dizzying, a kind of vertigo that would haunt her for weeks. Everything she'd believed was being rewritten, one ordinary moment at a time. And as they were loaded onto trucks and driven to their next destination, a new question began to take shape. If the enemy could be this human, what else about the world was waiting to be discovered? Arriving at Kemp Park was like stepping into a parallel universe. For Margaret, Elsa, and Katha, the word prison camp had always conjured images of barbed wire brutality and endless fear. That's what the Nazi regime had promised would happen if the Allies ever took them prisoner. But as the trucks rolled through the gates of Kemp Park, a former racetrack in the English countryside, what greeted them was nothing like the nightmare they'd been taught to expect. The grounds were wide and open, the grandstand building divided into dormitory sections with real beds, thin mattresses, and scratchy but clean blankets. For women who had spent months sleeping in bomb shelters or on the cold ground, it felt almost luxurious. The camp held hundreds of German women, and the number was growing every week. But the biggest shock wasn't the beds or the food, it was the guards themselves. The Canadian soldiers assigned to Kemp Park were nothing like the monsters of Nazi propaganda. They were healthy, well-fed, and most surprising of all, diverse. Some were of English or French Canadian descent, but others had faces and accents that hinted at backgrounds from all over the world. The Nazi regime had warned that Allied diversity meant chaos and danger. But what the women saw was a group of young men standing their posts with calm professionalism, some chatting quietly, one reading a book, none of them performing for the prisoners or acting out the roles they'd been assigned in German nightmares. Elsa watched one guard cross the yard, his stride unhurried, his face relaxed. He looked like any young man on an ordinary morning, not a savage conqueror. The ordinariness of it all was more disorienting than any act of violence could have been. Violence, after all, was something she'd been prepared for. This normalcy was something she had no defense against. The daily routine at Kemp Park was strict but humane. Breakfast was hot porridge, bread with margarine, a thin scraping of real jam, and tea with milk. The rations weren't generous, but after months of hunger and deprivation, even a simple meal felt extraordinary. Elsa, just 19, found herself eating hungrily, her body's needs overwhelming the ideology she'd been taught. She wrapped her hands around her mug of tea, feeling the warmth seep into her bones, and thought, "This is not what I was told." Margaret, ever the nurse, explored the camp's medical facility. She was stunned to find shelves stocked with real medicine, sulfa drugs, aspirin, iodine, more than she'd seen in her field hospital in months. The Canadian nurses worked with brisk efficiency, their clinical skills undeniable. Margaret wrote in the margin of a borrowed book, "They have more sulfa here than we had in 4 months." She tried to stop thinking about it, but she couldn't. Katha found work in the camp's administrative office, translating documents and observing the inner workings of the facility. She watched as every food allocation, every medical visit, every small detail was tracked and recorded. One afternoon, she overheard a British officer spend 12 minutes on the phone tracing a delayed shipment of canned fruit for the prisoners' Sunday meal. 12 minutes, just to make sure German prisoners had fruit. Katha thought of the cold, impersonal letter she'd received when her son was killed at the front. The contrast was almost painful. Spring arrived at Kemp Park with a gentleness that felt almost surreal. Crocuses bloomed along the fence line, the grass turned green, and the war, though still raging elsewhere, felt distant. News came through BBC bulletins, through new arrivals, through guards who answered questions honestly. The women read the news in small, quiet groups, each day bringing a little more clarity, a little more hope. But beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. The propaganda that had shaped their lives was unraveling, replaced by the undeniable evidence of their own eyes. The enemy was not a monster. The enemy was a person, sometimes bored, sometimes kind, always human. And as the days passed, the women of Kemp Park began to realize that the hardest part of captivity wasn't the fences or the rules. It was learning to let go of the lies they'd been told and to face the truth about the world and about themselves. Inside the fences of Kemp Park, something remarkable began to happen. The lines between enemy and ally, between us and them, started to blur in ways that no one could have predicted. For Margaret, Elsa, and Katha, the camp became a place of unexpected encounters, moments that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the world and about themselves. Margaret, the seasoned nurse from Hanover, found herself working side by side with Canadian medical staff. At first, she watched with a critical eye, expecting to find fault, but what she saw instead was competence, compassion, and a level of professionalism that matched her own. Patricia Tremble, a Canadian nurse from Quebec, became her partner in the infirmary. They spoke a patchwork of French, German, and medical Latin, bridging the language gap with gestures and shared experience. Margaret had been trained to believe that allied medicine was inferior, but Patricia's skill was undeniable. Each day, Margaret's respect grew, and with it, her understanding that the enemy was not so different after all. Elsa's transformation was louder, faster, and more public. She struck up a friendship with Harold Reeve, a young Canadian corporal from Winnipeg, the son of Ukrainian immigrants. Their conversations started with awkward exchanges about the weather, but soon grew into something deeper. Harold told Elsa about the vastness of Canada, about winters so cold they could freeze skin in minutes, about his family's journey across the Atlantic in search of a better life. Elsa listened, fascinated by a world she'd never imagined. One afternoon, Harold brought her a map of Canada, unfolding it in the exercise yard. Elsa stared at the endless prairies, the sprawling wilderness, the sheer scale of a country she'd been taught to ignore. "You have all this," she said, "and you came here." Harold's answer was simple. "We were asked, and it was the right thing to do." That night, Elsa wrote in her diary, "Everything was a lie. Not everything, but the most important things." Katha, ever the observer, watched the camp's daily life with the practiced eye of a schoolteacher. She saw how the Canadian and British staff treated the prisoners, not with cruelty but with a kind of distant respect. She noticed the care taken with food, with medical supplies, with even the smallest details of daily life. Katha began to teach herself English from a phrase book, determined to understand the conversations happening around her. She saw the camp's internal politics, the way some women clung to old beliefs while others began to question everything. For Katha, the transformation was quiet but profound, a slow realization that the world was bigger and more complicated than she'd ever been allowed to believe. These relationships, between nurse and nurse, prisoner and guard, teacher and student, became the foundation for something new. The propaganda that had shaped their lives began to crumble, replaced by real human connection. Margaret and Patricia shared stories of their families, their hopes, their fears. Elsa and Harold debated politics, history, and the meaning of freedom. Katha found herself translating not just words, but ideas, helping others in the camp see the world through new eyes. The transformation wasn't easy. There were moments of anger, of guilt, of deep confusion. Some women resisted, clinging to the old stories, afraid of what it would mean to let go. But for Margaret, Elsa, and Katha, the truth was impossible to ignore. The enemy was not a monster. The enemy was a person, flawed, complicated, and in many ways just like them. As spring turned to summer, the women of Kemp Park found themselves changed in ways they could never have imagined. The fences were still there, but inside something had shifted. The real battle was no longer against an outside enemy, but against the lies they'd been told and the courage it took to discover the truth for themselves. May 8, 1945. The world changed overnight. News of Germany's unconditional surrender swept through Kemp Park not with shouts or celebration but with a stunned, almost eerie silence. For Margaret, Elsa, Katha, and hundreds of other German women, the end of the war was not a moment of joy, it was a moment of reckoning. The guards posted the announcement quietly, in both German and English, on the main bulletin board. There was no gloating, no cruelty, just a simple piece of paper that signaled the collapse of everything these women had known. The reactions were as varied as the women themselves. Some wept openly, the weight of years of fear and loss finally breaking through. Others sat in silence, staring at the floor, unable to process what it meant to be truly defeated. A few even laughed, a wild, unhinged laughter that came from holding too much inside for too long. Elsa read the notice twice, then returned to her bunk, her mind spinning with questions she'd never dared to ask before. What did it mean to be German now? What did it mean to have believed in something that had fallen apart so completely? But the true turning point didn't come with the end of the war. It came in the days and weeks that followed, as the routines of camp life continued and the reality of defeat settled in. For Margaret, it was a quiet conversation with a Canadian nursing officer, Captain Alina Mackenzie. They spoke in careful French, each admitting the lies they'd been told about the other. There were no tears, no dramatic confessions, just two women stripped of propaganda speaking honestly for the first time. Margaret realized that the real enemy had never been the person in front of her, but the fear that had been planted in her heart. For Katha, the moment came in the form of a letter. Her surviving son Friedrich had been captured by the British but was alive and safe in a camp near Hamburg. The relief was overwhelming. She found herself thanking the British officer in charge not out of obligation but from a genuine sense of gratitude. The enemy, it turned out, had kept her son alive. Katha understood, perhaps more than anyone, that the world she'd returned to would demand new ways of thinking, new ways of living. Elsa's transformation was the most visible. She was watched closely by those who still clung to the old ideology, accused of being a traitor for daring to question what they'd all been taught. But Elsa knew she couldn't go back. She wrote in her diary about the girls she once led in the BDM, the lies she'd taught them, and her responsibility to set the record straight. She was determined to find them, to tell them the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or painful it might be. Not everyone changed. Some women doubled down, insisting that Germany had been betrayed, that the cause was still alive in their hearts. Ideology, after all, doesn't collapse overnight. But for Margaret, Elsa, and Katha, the end of the war was not just the end of fighting. It was the beginning of a new struggle, one that would last for years. They had to rebuild not just their homes, but their sense of self, their understanding of right and wrong, their place in a world that had been turned upside down. The aftermath of war is never simple. For these women, it meant facing the truth about what they'd believed, what they'd done, and what they would choose to do next. It meant learning that the most dangerous enemy is not always the one outside the fence, but the one inside your own mind. And as the days passed, one thing became clear. The hardest battles are fought not with guns or bombs, but with honesty, courage, and the willingness to change. As the months passed and the world outside Kemp Park slowly pieced itself back together, the question of going home became impossible to ignore. For Margaret, Elsa, and Katha, the idea of returning to Germany was both a promise and a threat. The fences of the camp had become strangely familiar, a place where old beliefs had been challenged and new truths had taken root. But beyond those fences lay a country in ruins, a place where the past could not be escaped, and the future was anything but certain. The process of repatriation was slow and complicated. The British and Canadian authorities faced the monumental task of returning millions of prisoners across a continent shattered by war. For the women at Kemp Park, the first departures began in the fall of 1945, 7 months after the war had ended. Each departure was marked by a mix of anxiety and hope. Some women clung to the comfort of the camp, afraid of what awaited them in the rubble of their former lives. Others longed for home, desperate to see family, to rebuild, to start again. Elsa left on a gray October morning, rain falling softly as she boarded the truck that would take her to the Channel port. She carried with her 2 diaries, an English-German phrasebook, and a slip of paper with Harold Reeves' address in Winnipeg. He had given it to her with a simple offer: write if you want, and if not, that's all right too. Elsa also reclaimed her BDM pin, not as a badge of honor, but as a reminder of who she had been and how far she had come. When she arrived in Germany, the devastation was overwhelming. Cities that had stood for centuries were now fields of broken stone. Children played in the ruins, their faces marked by a patience that came from expecting nothing. Elsa sat on a bench at the train station, thinking of the vast Canadian prairies Harold had described, and realized that understanding the world meant never forgetting where you started. Margaret returned to Hanover in November, finding her city almost unrecognizable. The hospital where she had trained was partially standing, and she reported for work on her third day back. The conditions were worse than anything she'd seen in the field, but she brought with her the notes and practices she'd learned at Kemp Park. Over the years, Margaret would rise to become director of nursing education, modernizing training programs, and quietly weaving in the lessons she'd learned from her Canadian colleagues. She and Patricia Tremble, the Canadian nurse, wrote letters for decades, their friendship a living testament to the power of connection across enemy lines. Katha's return brought her to a house with only 2 intact rooms, where her surviving son Friedrich waited. They stood together in the ruins, holding each other in silence, determined to build something new from the ashes. Katha went back to teaching, standing before children who had grown up inside 12 years of propaganda. She taught them geography first, showing them maps of the world as it really was, no country made to look bigger or more important than it should be. She encouraged questions, curiosity, and honesty, believing that the most subversive thing she could do was to help her students think for themselves. The legacy of Kemp Park lived on in the choices these women made. Elsa found 3 of her former BDM girls and told them the truth about what she had taught and why it was wrong. She went on to study history and political science, determined to understand and teach how propaganda works. Margaret modernized nursing in post-war Germany, never forgetting the lessons of compassion and professionalism she'd learned from her Canadian peers. Katha spent 20 years teaching children to see the world with open eyes, believing that truth was the only foundation worth building on. For American viewers, the story of Kemp Park is more than just a chapter in European history. It's a reminder of the power of truth, the danger of propaganda, and the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people. It's about what happens when we dare to question what we've been told and what we choose to do with the truth once we find it. The story of Kemp Park doesn't end with the gates swinging open or the last train home. Its real legacy lives on in the quiet, everyday choices made by women who had seen the world turned upside down and who chose to build something better from the ruins. For Margaret, Elsa, Katha, and countless others, the journey from fear to understanding was not a straight line. It was a struggle, a reckoning, and ultimately a testament to the power of truth over lies. What makes this story so relevant for American viewers today isn't just its historical weight, it's the universal lesson at its core. In a world where information is everywhere and misinformation spreads faster than ever, the experience of these women is a warning and a hope. They remind us that propaganda is never just about the enemy. It's about shaping how we see ourselves, our neighbors, and the world beyond our borders. The Nazi regime built its power on fear, on dividing people, on convincing ordinary citizens that the other was a threat. But when those walls finally fell, what was left wasn't hatred, it was the undeniable reality of shared humanity. Margaret's story is a lesson in humility and growth. She returned to a broken city and rebuilt not just hospitals but the very standards of care, drawing on what she'd learned from her supposed enemies. Elsa's journey is a blueprint for courage. She faced the girls she'd once led astray, admitted her mistakes, and dedicated her life to teaching the next generation how to think critically. Katha's legacy is one of quiet revolution, showing children the world as it truly is and giving them the tools to question, to wonder, and to seek the truth for themselves. For Americans, these stories echo in every debate about truth and trust, every conversation about what it means to be a good citizen, a good neighbor, a good human being. The lessons of Kemp Park are not locked in the past. They're alive in every moment we choose to look beyond fear to reach across divides, and to see the ordinary humanity in those we're told to hate. The most powerful part of this story isn't the shock of the first encounter or the drama of surrender. It's the slow, difficult work of unlearning lies and building something honest in their place. It's the realization that the enemy is often just another person, carrying a cup of tea, embarrassed by the weight of history and hoping for a better tomorrow. So as you finish this video, ask yourself, what stories have shaped your view of the world? What truths might be waiting just beyond the walls you've built? The women of Kemp Park learned, often painfully, that the cost of truth is high, but the cost of ignorance is higher. Their journey is a reminder that the search for understanding is never finished, and that the courage to question is the first step toward real freedom. If you found this story as powerful as I did, consider subscribing and joining a community dedicated to exploring the untold stories of history, stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us that the past is never really past. The lessons are there for anyone willing to learn. And sometimes, the most important truths are the ones we have to discover for ourselves.